So my name is Cliff Roan, and I'm going to be talking about healthy relationships. I work at Counseling Services here on campus, and we provide mental health services for students. So we do a lot of individual counseling. We also do couples counseling and group counseling. We do these sorts of presentations to students. We have online programs, lots of stuff. So we try to be accessible to students. One of the cool things about these Cat Chat presentations is we do them live over Zoom, and so sometimes we do have students who watch as well. I think there's a way that over Zoom, students can type in a message, and if you do that, I'll try to read that message and address any questions or comments that you might have. Okay, so an overview for what we're going to do today. First, I have some what I call fun facts. I don't know if you all will think they're fun or not, but hopefully they'll be interesting at least. And then we're going to talk a bit about common sources of conflict. So when we talk about relationships, unfortunately, relationships often involve some level of conflict, and it's important to know how to handle that conflict because it probably will arise at some point. So a big portion of the conversation today will be about managing that conflict, which involves discussing communication styles and communication skills. And then I want to talk about something called love languages, and we'll get into what that means towards the end of the presentation, but I think that's relevant not just to dating relationships, but to relationships as a whole. And lastly, I'll discuss some resources. So in terms of fun facts, all of the fun facts I have for y'all today are about dating relationships. And so this is the results of a particular study. And this was a study done at one particular university where they surveyed over 800 students that were currently enrolled at the university. And there's a few things that they found. One of which is that being in a committed relationship was associated with less depression symptoms for women, but not for men. So that's kind of interesting that there seems to be a gender difference there. And then the other piece they looked at was problematic alcohol use. So not just alcohol use as a whole, but alcohol use that led to issues or problems. And what they found is that being in a relationship was associated with less problematic alcohol use regardless of gender, so both for men and women. Do you have any thoughts about that or any reactions?
It's a little odd.
A little odd.
I don't know. That's interesting. I never really thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it didn't say that for the depression symptoms that it meant people were actually at the level of clinically depressed, but just overall how many symptoms. Because a lot of times everybody's experiencing a little bit of symptomology consistent with depression, which doesn't mean that you actually meet criteria for depression. So another study was done at the university, or at a university in the state of Georgia, and they were looking at several factors again, and this was all about the frequency of hooking up. Do you know what the term hooking up refers to?
I mean, for me, it refers to sex.
Okay.
But, I mean, it can mean different things to different people.
Yeah. So you were saying that for you, it refers to sex specifically, but you're exactly right. For different people, hooking up means different things. So I think in general, most people, when they talk about hooking up, there's an element of physical intimacy with somebody, and you tend not to know that person really well, meaning it's not somebody you've been dating for 3 months, because if that was the case, then people wouldn't typically refer to it as hooking up. So yeah, they were looking at hooking up and how often students hooked up based on some other things. So one of the things they looked at was students' year in college, and if you're a first year, sophomore, junior, or senior. And one thing they found, which feels pretty obvious to me, is that if you were a senior, you had been engaging in more hooking up than if you were a first year student. Another thing they looked at was religious affiliation, and they broke that down into several groups. So they had Catholic, Protestant, and what they called conservative Protestants, which I'm not exactly sure how they define these differences, but what they found is that the people who identified as conservative Protestant were hooking up less than people who identified as other religious groups. They also found that based on how students defined hooking up, they were engaging in hooking up more or less. So I think that's an important piece to think about big picture, is that not everybody defines hooking up the same way, and that can have an impact on what they report in terms of how often they do it. And then lastly, they found that the frequency of students hooking up was not impacted by their social class or their gender. When we say social class, do you know what I mean by that?
Like middle class, like high class, like I don't know. those kind of classes. Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like a very sort of straightforward way to say it would be how much money you or your family has.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's kind of interesting that they didn't find a difference in frequency of hooking up based on social class or gender. I think there's a perception that men may engage in hooking up more, or maybe people have perceptions that based on your social class you might hook up more or less or that sort of thing. But in this particular study, they didn't find any of those correlations. So here's another one. They did a research study, again with university students, about heterosexual relationships. And they looked at the hookup culture. And they asked a question of, in heterosexual relationships, do men or women benefit more from a hookup culture? What do you think?
The men.
The men do.
I feel like women are more emotionally attached
Okay.
sometimes, and it gets to and it just like the guy doesn't really care. So I feel like it benefits the males more.
Okay. And what you just described is essentially the conclusion they came to in the study as well, is that men tend to benefit, at least seem to tend to benefit more from the hookup culture. And part of the reason for that is what you're talking about, that emotional connection. And if you're engaging in hooking up, there's typically the assumption that you're not in a committed relationship. And so you could be hooking up with multiple people at the same time, and that sort of relationship style tends to benefit males more than females. Okay, so last fun fact for right now. Do you think being in a dating relationship and spending time talking on the phone to the person that you're dating were or were not positively related with life satisfaction? So life satisfaction is a term they use. We have questionnaires that measure it. It just essentially means like how happy or content are you with life overall. So the question is, if you're in a dating relationship and you're spending time talking to that person on the phone, do you say you're happier and more satisfied overall, or you're less happy and less satisfied overall?
I mean, I guess it just depends. I mean, I'm not like super picky and like, oh, you have to like talk to me on the phone or I'm not gonna be happy with you. Like, I'm kind of like in the middle on that one.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Sure. And I think you have a great point that depending on the type of person, that could impact it. I also think depending on the type of relationship, because like some relationships aren't so healthy, and spending time with that person or talking to that person on the phone is not necessarily going to improve your life satisfaction.
Yeah.
But what they found overall when they surveyed a lot of people was that being in a relationship and spending time talking on the phone to that person was positively related with life satisfaction.
Yeah, not like all the time though. Like, just like you don't want to be on the phone all the time. That's like what I was getting at. But,
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
So
like there's people like that who are just like always on their phones and talking to that significant other, and I'm like, you don't have to be talking to them every single minute of the day.
so maybe there's a healthy balance.
Yeah,
Moderation.
Yeah.
Okay. So next we're going to talk about sources of conflict. And before we get into anything, I just want to point out that picture in the top right. I really love that guy's face. He looks like both surprised and very hurt at the same time.
Yeah, I can't really distinguish it now that you like pointed it out.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty great facial expression.
It is funny.
So we're going to talk about two types of sources of conflict in a relationship. One is described as internal sources of conflict, and one is external sources of conflict. So what do you think we mean by internal versus external sources of conflict?
Internal, like you're keeping your anger in, or you're keeping something
Oh.
in and you're not wanting to talk to your significant other about it.
Oh, okay.
External is more like yelling or like
Oh.
just to the point where you're just spilling everything out.
Okay, it's
That's
all
what I
coming
think.
out,
That's-
it's not being kept in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, and that makes sense. That's not how they define it.
Oh, okay.
But I see what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense. For the purposes here, what they're describing as internal means that the source of conflict is within the relationship. So an example would be like communication or emotional connection within the relationship. And so sometimes you might have people who are in a dating relationship and they actually have like very similar wants and needs, but they struggle to communicate those wants and needs well. And so they can create conflict in their relationship because of their communication issues, not so much because they don't actually match up well in what they want or need. Another example, a very common example of a source of conflict in relationships is sex or physical intimacy. So, there's a lot of things. There could be too little, too much, it's not enjoyable, etc., moving too fast, moving too slow. There's so many ways that sex and physical intimacy can create issues in relationships. And then infidelity is another one. So, do you know what I mean by infidelity? Mm-hmm. Infidelity means like being unfaithful.
Oh, okay.
So there are multiple ways that some people define infidelity. Some would say infidelity is only when you're physically intimate with someone outside the relationship. Other people can define infidelity as like emotional cheating, if you've heard of that before. So that might be you're texting a lot or you're using social media to connect a lot with someone outside of the relationship. And some people would consider that being unfaithful. So a little fun fact for you here is I found a study about college students and infidelity, and what they found is for students who engage in infidelity, they are less likely to be securely attached. And securely attached means you can develop a healthy attachment with someone and you can have a lot of trust or confidence in that attachment, meaning that you trust that that person likes you and they actually want to be with you. They also found that for folks who don't engage in infidelity, they tend to be lower in narcissism. Do you know what narcissism means?
Not really.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, like I always hear different like definitions about it.
Sure. Yeah, so narcissism, it's kind of complex and it can include a lot of different things, but in general what it means is that you think very highly of yourself. And so if I'm narcissistic, I think I'm really quite great. And so what they found is that if folks think they are really quite great, then they're more likely to engage in infidelity. If you don't have that sort of inflated sense of self, then you're less likely to engage in infidelity. And the last correlation they found was high in empathy. So do you know what empathy means?
Like feeling bad for someone else or something like that?
Yeah, that would be an example of empathy.
I don't know,
Yeah, so empathy is understanding what other people are feeling. So if you're with somebody who's sad, you might feel sad for them or with them. If you're with somebody who's really happy, you might think and feel, oh, that person's really happy, and be able to identify with their happiness. So these are some internal sources of conflict. What are your guesses about external sources of conflict? So external sources would be anything outside of the relationship itself that creates conflict for the relationship.
Oh God. I don't know, finances, like
Finances.
popped up in my head.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
like a big one for my parents.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Finances,
Finances,
very common.
kids.
Yes, raising kids, parenting.
Oh yeah, I think those are the only two that I really like, I guess, relate with. So.
Okay, yeah, finances and kids or parenting, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you got two of the really big ones. They did a study, I tried to find it for this presentation, but I couldn't. They did a study about 10 years ago at a college in the state of Washington, and they asked college students, what do you fight about most frequently? Like you and your partner, what do you all fight about most frequently? And there were two answers that were the most common. One was sex, and the other was money. And what they found is that for couples who argued and fought about sex the most, they were couples who didn't live together. And so the assumption was they weren't living together, so it was hard for them to find time to be physically intimate. The money piece was most common when the couples did live together. So it's like if you live together, then you tend to argue and fight about money more often, probably because they're trying to figure out how to balance their budget and make decisions about how to spend money. But there are a lot of external sources of conflict for relationships because we tend to have busy lives with a lot of stuff going on. And so money, school, especially for college students or graduate students, work, families, and then so family would be like, if someone is dating someone, how their parents and siblings might think and feel about the relationship and that sort of thing. And then there's parenting. So if the people in a relationship, if one or them together have children, that can be a source of conflict. And then pretty much everything else that exists could also cause conflict. So any questions or thoughts about that difference between internal and external sources of conflict?
Nope, that's pretty clear.
Okay, cool. So in terms of managing conflict, we're going to first talk about communication styles. So I'm going to discuss 4 different communication styles with y'all. And it's important to try to identify your communication style in a relationship, and it's important to try to understand your partner's communication style. Because if they're not matching up, that might be one of the reasons that you can't address conflict as well as you want to. So the first communication style we'll discuss is called aggressive. So this is a very brief summary or overview. But for someone whose communication style is aggressive, that means that they put other people down to protect themselves. So here'd be a very sort of commonplace example. Let's say that I made a joke at someone and they felt like that joke was offensive or hurtful. And so they said to me, Cliff, you know, that joke hurt my feelings. Well, if I said back to them, oh, you're just being a baby, or oh, you're too sensitive, it's not my fault, that would be aggressive communication, because I'm saying, no, it's not my problem, you are the problem. So for someone who communicates aggressively, they tend to try to achieve their goals, and they're willing to try to achieve their goals in ways that might be at the expense of other people. Any questions about that? No? Okay. So the next one I'm going to talk about is passive. And a lot of times people will say that aggressive and passive are kind of the opposite. But that may be a little bit of an oversimplification. So for someone who's passive, they operate under this assumption that they should never make anyone feel uncomfortable or displeased. The exception is themselves. So if I were communicating passively, if I felt uncomfortable or displeased, like my needs were not being met, I would be okay with that. I might not like it, but I wouldn't try to change it. But if I was interacting with anybody else and I thought they were uncomfortable or displeased, I would do whatever I could to try to make them not be uncomfortable or displeased. And so for folks who communicate in a passive way, they're going to be more likely to feel anxious, ignored, helpless, manipulated, or angry. But if they do feel angry, they're typically not going to address it or bring it up or share that they're feeling angry with the other person. So now here, the third type is called passive-aggressive, and this is a combination of the two in a way. So a person who communicates in a passive-aggressive style, they have a need to be heard, unlike the passive approach, but they will do things in a manipulative way if they feel that's what it takes to be heard. So the classic example of passive-aggressive communication would be, imagine that there's a couple and they're in a kitchen and they're having an argument, and the one person asks the other person, are you mad? And the person says, no, I'm not mad. And then they slam a cupboard door shut, you know? So it's like I tell you, no, I'm not mad, but then I behave in a way that acts as if I am mad. So that would be the classic example of passive-aggressive. So I'm upset and I'm trying to get my needs met, but I'm not going to verbally express necessarily how to meet those needs, or I might go about trying to meet those needs in a manipulative way. And it's not intentional. It's not that they think to themselves, oh, how could I do this manipulatively? It just comes out that way. So for folks who communicate in a passive-aggressive style, they tend to feel confused or angry, but they're not sure why they're confused or angry. And then lastly, communication style is assertive. So for folks who communicate in an assertive way, the idea is that they understand that they have rights and that other people have rights. And so if I'm communicating in an assertive fashion, I'm going to respect the fact that I have rights, and I'm going to respect the fact that the other person has rights. But along with this, it means that I may not appreciate the other person's behavior. So, I can still understand and respect that someone has rights, but not approve of the way in which they're going about something. So, any questions about these four styles?
No.
As I described them, could you think of interactions that you've ever had with people or people that you know in your life that might fall into any of these?
My dad.
Your dad, okay.
Passive-aggressive.
Passive-aggressive, okay. Can you think of an example where you feel like he communicated in a passively aggressive way?
What was the question?
Can you think of an example where he may have communicated in a passive-aggressive way?
He says he's not mad, but yet he'll like yell at you or something, like that. Yeah, and it's just like, I thought you weren't mad at me.
Yeah,
Why are you yelling?
Yeah, right. So if you say you're not mad, but then you yell at me.
Yeah, he's confusing.
Yeah. Okay. Sure, that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about how to manage an argument. So again, the communication style piece is it's helpful to understand how you communicate. It's helpful to identify and understand how other people communicate in your relationships. But arguments and conflict are inevitable. Even the healthiest relationship has some arguments or disagreements and conflicts. So I think what makes a healthy relationship is not having arguments and conflict, but it's how do you handle the arguments and conflict when they occur. Now granted, sometimes some relationships have them more frequently than others, but all relationships have them. So here's my first piece of advice, if you will. Stay calm. And if you can't stay calm, you should bail. You should leave. You should just get out of there. Why do you think I make that recommendation?
I don't know. Because, like, it could get worse. Like, you don't want to, like, freak out on the person completely and then, like...
Exactly. So when we think about effective communication and healthy communication, if you're not calm, you're not going to be able to do it very well. So whether it be really sad or really mad or really anxious, once we hit a certain point of emotionality, it's going to be really hard for us to communicate well. Now, this in no way means that emotions are unhealthy or problematic, because they're not. Emotions are really important and they're really healthy, but sometimes emotions can get in our way when we have a certain goal that we're trying to achieve. So if your goal is to manage an argument or a conflict, but you're really, really pissed, then you should not try to talk to the person that you're really pissed at in that moment.
Yeah, you just don't want to say something you'll regret. And then it's
Exactly, yeah, say something you regret. And what will happen a lot of times is if you're really upset and you go to that person, they're going to respond by getting really upset also, because they may feel attacked or defensive or something like that. So if you're really upset and they're really upset, good luck having anything productive come from that.
Yeah.
So that's that piece about if you can't do it calmly at that time, you should leave and do it at some other point in the future. Another component, and this is a must, is listening to what the person has to say and actually caring what they have to say. If you notice that you're having a debate or an argument with someone and you don't actually care what they're saying, then chances are nothing effective is going to come from that. So one example here might be politics. A lot of people get touchy and sensitive about politics, right? And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I mean, it's a touchy topic for a lot of people, and that's okay. But if you're debating someone about politics and you literally don't care what the other person is saying, then my advice would be, well, why are you having the conversation? Because you're clearly not trying to learn from them, and you're not trying to understand their perspective, and they may not be trying to learn or understand your perspective. So probably nothing productive is going to happen from this. And I think if you're in a dating relationship, or if you're in a relationship with a family member and you find that you're not actually caring what they have to say, then chances are you're not going to be able to work with them to help something productive come from that discussion. So it's probably better that you just say, you know what, we're probably not going to benefit. Let's go ahead and just stop this now. And so the last piece here for managing an argument is to communicate clearly and respectfully. And we're going to talk about this more for a few minutes. I have an example here of clear communication that's not exactly respectful. So if I said to someone, I hate you, that's pretty clear. They know what I mean by that, but that's not respectful. So if you're having a conversation or disagreement with someone and you or the other person are not communicating clearly and respectfully, then it's probably better just to walk away. And in terms of discussing walking away from a conversation, I don't necessarily advocate that you just turn your back and leave, because that can be confusing to the other person. They don't know how to interpret that. That can also cause people to feel even more upset than they did before you left. So what I recommend, if you do decide this conversation isn't effective or helpful, is that you tell the person that you're feeling that way, and you tell them when you're willing to come back and revisit this discussion. So maybe it's a day from then, maybe it's you need to go for a walk and then you can come back and talk some more or whatever. But if you just turn your back and walk away, you should probably expect that person to be confused and or even more upset. So just an important point to think about. Something else I think it's important to think about is culture. And we're all raised in whatever culture we're raised in. And the country that we live in and the family that we grow up with, those things all impact our culture. And so that can impact things like whether or not you think it's appropriate to raise your voice. Some people grow up in situations where raising their voice is not aggressive. It's not mean. It doesn't mean they want confrontation. But in some cultures it does. Another piece to consider is talking back to an elder. So some people are taught you should never talk back to an elder. It's very disrespectful. You don't do that. Other cultures, it's okay to talk back to elders. Same thing with making sustained eye contact. For white European American folks, when you're having a discussion or a debate, it's very typical to make eye contact. And if you're not making eye contact, that may be interpreted as you're not engaged, you don't care, or something along those lines. But for other people, depending on how they were raised, making sustained eye contact can actually be considered rude or something like that. So they're not necessarily going to do that the same way in conversations. So when you have an argument with someone, it's important to consider their culture as well. And that doesn't mean like just culture in terms of race or ethnicity, but also what the family culture was like. And some people, they don't talk a lot about emotions, or it's really hard for them to talk about emotions. Other people, they talk about emotions very openly. And so those types of things can also be factors in miscommunication or not feeling heard. So next, we're going to talk about communication skills, specifically nonviolent communication. Have you ever heard that term before, nonviolent communication?
Yeah.
Yeah?
It's not violent.
Yes, it's not violent. So there are 4 steps to nonviolent communication. And the goal here with nonviolent communication is that you are able to communicate to another person in a way that is effective. It doesn't increase hostility. It doesn't increase anger. It helps with communication without making the situation worse. So the first component to nonviolent communication is to observe. And by observation, they mean see what's actually happening in the situation that's affecting your well-being. And we're going to go through this a couple different ways, so I think it'll make sense by the time we get to the end of it. The next step is feeling. So you need to observe what's happening, but then the next step is to identify how you're feeling about this action that's taking place. And then there's typically a need. So when I'm frustrated or upset with someone, it's probably because a need or a value or a desire is not being met or not being addressed. And so I need to figure out what that need is that's creating this conflict or this discomfort for me. And then lastly, I need to be able to identify a specific request. So if I'm going to ask this person to communicate differently, or we're going to have a conversation about this, I need to know what it is that I want to be different in order for me to ask this person to change. So here's another breakdown of how this works. In nonviolent communication, there's 4 pieces. And so the first one is observation. So if I'm going to communicate to someone in this style, I will say when I, and then it might be see this or hear this, or when I saw you talk to John that way, whatever the action might be. So that's where the observation piece comes in so that you can describe the specific action that took place. Then number 2 is the feeling part. So when I saw you talk to John that way, I felt hurt or scared or whatever the feeling may have been because I was afraid that you were upset with John or whatever it might be. And so here's where you explain what the need was. And in this case, maybe my need was I'm afraid about what's happening between John and this other person. And then lastly would be stating a concrete action. I would like you to. So in this case, it might be I would like you to not raise your voice, when you're talking with John. So here's another example where they lay out the whole thing at once. So when I see you leaving your dirty dishes on the counter, I feel frustrated because I need you to contribute with household tasks. I would like you to put your dishes in the dishwasher after you use them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you notice about this? Does anything stand out to you?
I don't know.
No? Okay, that's fine. There isn't a specific answer. One thing that stands out to me is how much emphasis there is put on the I part of it, as opposed to the you part of it. Because if you think about unhealthy arguments and conversation, like if you watch movies or sitcoms on TV or Netflix, you'll see when people argue, they typically don't argue like this. It's typically like, you screwed that up, you're an idiot. Well, that's very different than this, because you can communicate that same message using nonviolent communication, but typically in unhealthy communication, we don't. There's a lot more finger pointing and a lot more blaming. And this is beneficial because it backs off of the finger pointing and the blaming. And what that does is it allows the other person to be more able to hear the concern. So if I have a concern with someone, but I say, you're an idiot, you shouldn't have done it that way, they're probably not going to hear my concern. All they're going to hear is that I'm a jerk and I'm blaming them for something. Whereas if I put it in these words, they're probably going to be able to understand, oh, okay, Cliff is bothered about this thing for this reason, and I can sort of see where he's coming from. So the important piece here is that it allows you to dialogue more about the issue as opposed to just pointing fingers or being upset with one another. Any questions or reactions to this? Okay. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit from talking about conflict and how to manage conflict to love languages. Now, love languages is a term that's been around for a long time, 20, 25 years, something like that. An author, I can't think of the name, but I think I have it on a slide later on, wrote a book about the 5 love languages. And here's the whole premise, is that different people show that they love or care about someone in a different way. So this picture here with these 2 guys, I don't know if they're friends or if they're dating or married or what, but it doesn't matter, because the point is that we show that we care about people or love people, whether we're in a romantic relationship with them, a family relationship with them, or friends, or whatever. So the love languages applies not just to dating relationships, but to all relationships when we care about someone. So again, there are 5 of these, and the first one is called acts of service. What do you think an example might be of an act of service?
I don't know, doing something for someone, like just getting them food. Like,
Yeah,
there's
perfect.
one.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. So an act of service would be doing something for someone. And you gave the example of getting food for them. It could be these 2 guys in the picture, they each have a drink. Maybe one of them poured the drink for the other one, right? That would be an act of service. So can you think of an example where you've maybe done an act of service for someone else, or someone in your life has done an act of service for you?
My parents giving me money for groceries.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah.
I think that counts.
Okay. Now, that is a really good example of showing that they care or they love you.
Yeah.
I think that might actually fall into a different category.
Would it?
It might.
Oh,
We'll talk
okay.
about that a little
I
more.
don't know.
I'm even thinking about something more mundane, like holding the door for someone. Like, let's say you're walking into a restaurant with a family member and they open the door for you. I think it's very, very small, but I think that would be an act of service too. So let's talk about the next one, quality time.
Spending time with them.
Yes, exactly, spending time with them. Why do you think they put the word quality on there and not just say spend time together?
Because some of the time isn't quality. So, like, it's just kind of like, if you just see them for like 2 seconds, that's not like quality time. That's just like, oh, I see you. Like, quality time, like actually like probably like watching a movie with them or like eating dinner with them, something like that.
Yeah. So I think you're definitely on the right track. It's about the couple or multiple people defining the time spent together as meaningful. Yeah, so like if I'm sitting in the same room as somebody, but I'm on my iPad and they're on their phone and we don't talk to each other or look at each other or interact at all, we're technically spending time together, but for some people that wouldn't feel like quality time. Versus those examples you gave, eating a meal with somebody or going to a movie with somebody, that sort of thing, that for a lot of people would probably feel like quality time. They're engaged in this meaningful activity together. Receiving gifts. So this is the one with your parents and the money for food that I wondered if maybe that falls into this category more, would be the receiving gifts. Because if they went to the grocery store and bought the food for you and brought it to you, then I'd probably say, okay, that sounds more like an act of service because they went and did the thing. So receiving gifts, for some people, this is one of the only ways that they experience being cared about, is if they receive a physical, tangible gift. And it could be money, it could be I made a homemade card. It could be, little kids will go to school and they'll like glue macaroni onto a sheet of paper and bring it home to their family or whatever, That technically is a gift that kid is giving to someone. So there's no definition of what the gift has to be, but it's just a tangible thing that someone gives to someone else to show that they care. Words of affirmation. Can you guess what that might mean?
Like compliments,
Yeah.
reassuring them.
Yeah. Yeah, very good.
Like that.
Yeah. So anything kind of positive towards the other person to let them know that you appreciate them, you care about them, you're glad they're in your life, you respect them, any of those sorts of things would be words of affirmation and how we show we care about each other. An example here would be, like, let's say that when you were a little kid, you had a caregiver who would come tuck you in to bed at night and they'd say, I love you, when they tucked you in bed. Like, that could be an example of words of affirmation. They're letting you know that they care about you. So the last one, physical touch.
It could be anything really, like just patting them on the shoulder, or
Yeah.
or like hugging them,
Yeah.
Giving them a kiss, like
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Holding hands.
Yeah,
I know
holding
that one's
hands.
a big one.
Yeah, putting your arm around someone. Yeah, absolutely. So physical touch is another way where we tend to show people that we care about them. And I think this is an important point to think about when, if you've ever, maybe not experienced yourself, but if you've ever seen someone like, I don't know, put their arm on someone in a way that seems uncomfortable for the other person. I think that happens because some people have different expectations and boundaries around physical touch. Like, I might not be okay with someone putting their hand on my back, but I might be okay with someone putting their hand on my shoulder. But we're all different in terms of what we experience as okay and how we experience people showing that they care about us through physical touch. Yeah, so other than that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of physical touch. And again, not just in dating relationships, but yeah, holding hands or giving a hug when you see a relative or friend, all those sorts of things. So when you think about love languages, the important thing to think about is, what are the ways in which you tend to show others that you care about them? And then a second good question to ask yourself is, how do I feel cared about? Like, what would someone, if I'm in a dating relationship, what would someone have to do for me to feel cared about? If they bought me a present, would that make me feel cared about? If they said words of affirmation to me, would that make me feel cared about? If we spent quality time together, would that make me feel cared about? So they've done some research, and what they have found is that different people tend to perceive being cared about in different ways. And typically what we find is that everybody recognizes all 5 of these as ways that people show they care. But for some people, some of these 5 are much more important than others. And so you could be in a relationship with someone where maybe they shower you with gifts. Like, every day they're buying you presents and bringing you gifts. And for some people, that would be perfect. That'd be amazing. That'd be their dream come true. For other people, they would say, well, that's nice and all, but we don't ever spend any quality time together, so I don't feel cared about. Or they might say, that's nice and all, but you don't do any acts of service for me, so I don't feel that you really care about me or you're really invested in the relationship. So love languages is not so much about conflict, but conflict can come from people having different love languages. Okay. And again, here's another time when it's really important to consider culture. So depending on someone's socioeconomic status, which is another way of saying their social class or how much money they or their family have, considering age, considering gender, country of origin, all those things can impact how we experience being cared about and how we have been taught to show we care about others. So and again, this isn't just about culture in terms of a specific identity, but the way we're raised. Different families show they care differently. Like, some families, they almost never or literally never say, I love you to one another. But they still might know that that person loves them, and it's because they show it through other ways. Okay, so we're going to talk about some resources. Now, remember a few slides back when we were discussing internal sources and external sources of stress in relationships. Well, if you have a lot of external stress in your life, so maybe it's classes, maybe it's work, maybe it's family stuff, you've got all that going on, and you're in a dating relationship, it's going to be a lot harder for you to have a healthy and happy dating relationship if you're not managing that stress that you have in your life that's coming from other sources besides the relationship itself. So there are a lot of things at Counseling Services that we offer that can help with that stress in your life. So that would be things like our Feel Better Fast workshops. So these are free and open to any student who's a student here at the Manhattan campus. And those are workshops that they teach you skills for managing stress in general. We also have biofeedback, which is a program we do in office at Counseling Services. We don't have it up and running right now, but at most times of the year we do. And biofeedback is where we hook your body up to a bunch of sensors, and we can measure how much stress your body is feeling. Because sometimes people, their bodies are very stressed, but they're not really aware that their body is super stressed. An example would be like if you ever hear people complain about my neck or my shoulders are really tight because I carry my stress there. Or some people might complain about their lower back. Like when I get really stressed out, I carry my stress in my lower back. Well, that's one of the things that biofeedback can look at. And we can look at the body and see how the body's responding and acting, and then help the person be able to become aware of that and then learn, what does that mean for me? If my shoulders are really tense, what does that mean? Maybe it means I need to go for a walk. Maybe it means I need to do some exercise or some yoga to relieve some stress. So other ways to manage stress are exercise and yoga, and we have an online stress management program as well. So that's free. It's accessible to K-State students to do over the internet. It's self-paced. So there's several resources for managing stress in general. Another thing is to practice communication. If you want your relationship to go well, you have to be able to communicate effectively with that person. And so ways to practice communication would be socializing, participating in clubs or organizations, and at Counseling Services for students on the Manhattan campus, we offer group therapy. And group therapy can be pretty scary, the idea of doing that with your peers, but it is really helpful and effective for a lot of concerns. So if you're having relationship issues, communication issues, anxiety, especially if you have social anxiety, a lot of those things can be helped through group therapy as much or more than individual counseling can help them. So just throwing that out there as an idea for some folks who might benefit from that. Now, a couple of sources to look into more if you want more information. There's always information to read, and that's good. It's good that we have sources that we can go to. So there's a website about practicing nonviolent communication, and there's a lot of books been written and web pages out there about nonviolent communication, which is cool because that means it's very accessible. It's easy to find, and there's lots of good resources to help you think through how you can practice doing that if it's something that you think would be a beneficial skill. There's also a book called The New Rules of Marriage. Now, I really like a lot of things about this book because it focuses on communicating about emotions. And in like a white European American cultural background, a lot of men are not taught how to communicate about emotions very well. But women typically are taught how to communicate about emotions. So if someone's in a heterosexual relationship and they find that they want to communicate about emotions more, or they want their partner to communicate about emotions more, but it's not happening, this can be a really good book to read because it discusses how to be aware of your emotions and how to communicate your emotions to your partner in a way that's not threatening, in a way that's healthy and productive. And so this author, Terrence Real, he called the book The New Rules of Marriage because his whole premise is that 50 years ago, a lot of men were not expected to communicate about emotions. But nowadays, people in dating relationships typically expect you to be able to communicate about emotions. And so if you don't know how to communicate about emotions, you're behind. And these are the new rules of marriage, and you might need to learn some of this. So one of the things I don't like about the book is that he talks about marriage as like heterosexual, one man, one woman, and just goes off that premise, which I get. And a lot of marriages are composed of that, but not all. So it's not inclusive of everyone. Another factor is the cultural piece here. So we were talking about country of origin, the way your family did things, your social class, all those things can impact how you communicate or how you are in a dating relationship, and he doesn't really address that topic either. So he kind of has like a one-size-fits-all approach, and I don't think it does fit all, but I think depending on what's going on in a particular relationship, it could be a really helpful book. And then there's another one. This book is kind of similar in that it's about dating relationships and marriage and how to make them work well. And it gives you these 7 principles to work on in a relationship. And I think in general, they're really good principles. And this is written by John Gottman and Nan Silver. And John Gottman and Julie Gottman are both psychologists. And they work in actually Washington State. And they have a love lab where they study couples. And they bring couples into their love lab. And they hook them up to sensors. They hook them up to sensors. They videotape them while they're talking to each other. And they bring them in and they say, okay, we want y'all to pick up with whatever your most recent argument was. Like whatever the thing was that y'all argued about most recently, we want y'all to talk about that here. And then they videotape them while they argue with each other. And they study it, and they study why do they argue, how do they argue, why do some couples, this was like their main question that they started with originally, was why do some couples get divorced and some don't? And they looked at how couples argue, and they learned some differences between if you tend to do this when you argue, you're more likely to get divorced than if you don't do those things. And so that's really what this book is about. So it's very fascinating, but again, it's pretty specific to like white European American middle class folks. So depending on your background and your culture, the principles in the book may not fit perfectly well for you. But those are some examples of resources. Some other resources would be counseling services. So again, that's where I work here on campus, and counseling services will provide services to anybody who's currently enrolled at the Manhattan campus. And again, you know, I've already talked about all the things that we do there. So that's our contact information. And if you want more information about us, you can look us up online. We have our webpage through kstate.edu. You can call us and ask questions. And even if you're not on the Manhattan campus and you can't come work with us in person, you can access a lot of the resources that we have on our website, and those can be helpful for some students as well. Another resource that I want to make sure people know about is the Family Center. Have you ever heard of the Family Center? Okay, so the Family Center is here on Manhattan's campus, and they're on Campus Creek Drive. Do you know where Campus Creek Drive is?
I know where that is. I walk by it every day.
Yeah. Okay, so the Family Center is on Campus Creek Drive, and they are through the Marriage and Family Therapy Department. And they are also a mental health agency, but they will serve anybody who comes to them. So you don't have to be a K-State student. You don't have to be enrolled in classes on Manhattan's campus. And they will serve people from the community. And because these are graduate students who are studying marriage and family therapy, they kind of specialize in relationships and family issues. And so that's why I want to make sure and talk about them today, is because our topic is healthy relationships. So the Family Center is a really good source for relationship concerns if someone is having relationship concerns that they think are to the level of wanting to go to couples counseling or something like that. Okay, any questions?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. And lastly, I wanted to show the citations for those different fun facts that I talked about at the beginning. These are the citations for the articles where that information came from. And that's it for me for today.